Good evening, Rebecca and Elliot.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great, thank you so much. Welcome back to our C.S. Lewis reading book study discussion.
Yeah.
So this is the third session, and I'm excited to dive in and discuss about a third of this book, which describes the story of C.S. Lewis, considered the greatest Christian or apologist of Christianity in the 20th century, and his popularity is growing more than ever before. So very, very influential figure. We'll be looking at his conversion story in his book, Surprised by Joy. So let's dive right in. But before we look at some of the middle part of the story where he is like a teenager, he's going through stories of doubt and despair, and how that eventually leads him to begin to find God, but a painful chapters in his life, right? But I want to kind of step back and think about what is the point of this whole book, right? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, we're trying to understand the main point or the theme of the whole book, which it's in the title, which is Surprised by Joy, right? That really captures joy. The whole point of the whole book, but it's much more meaningful than that. So I want to start out by asking you the question, why does C.S. Lewis choose this theme, joy, Surprised by Joy, as the title of his conversion story?
So when actually reading the book, like even till chapter 10 that we read until today, a lot of it also has to do with like literature or other things from the world that he saw and he observed and he loved. And he's repetitively talking about how he was finding like true joy and happiness and like really truth in there, in like, and God's beauty in all of the things that he enjoyed in his earlier life. And it's like a constant reminder that God was present in his life in various forms almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Elliot?
I feel like throughout chapters 1 through 10, I think like the title of the book, Surprised by Joy, is shown quite literally, where like every time he feels that stab of joy, it's unexpected, and he somewhat has forgotten the feeling, and through different people that he meets or different things he sees or experiences, he suddenly feels that stab of joy again. So he's constantly being surprised by it. And I think for me, I feel like this feeling of being surprised by this joy kind of directly relates to Christianity in a way where I think we feel these stabs of joy whenever we feel God's presence. And I think the act of kind of wanting more of it is how we should approach Christianity in a way.
Yes.
Which, for me, like, I would want to feel that feeling again, and I don't want to quite lose it, knowing how it could be when you fall away. So just quite literally, just constantly being surprised by it and constantly wanting more is how I thought of how I should approach like the religion and the faith.
Yes, thank you for good explanations about what he's trying to do here. So I see three things going on here. Just the bigger picture of what Lewis is trying to do in explaining his own conversion story is that it's really about joy, right? The stabs of joy that he experiences. That's what Christianity is all about. To put it differently, it's not so much about like achievements, like what I can achieve, right? Which is what most religion tells people to do. But it's about receiving or discovering, right? What God does to me, stabs of joy from heaven. And so it's at the core of what Christianity is. But notice he doesn't use Christianese, right? Because he really wants to reach out to non-Christians as well.
Yeah.
That's why he doesn't call it the gospel, which it is. He's trying to explain the gospel to non-Christians and Christians alike. He really tries to talk, plain language about what not just the gospel or the Bible is all about, but what life is really all about. And he tells his own story of it, the painful process that he went through for years before he began to barely discover it, right? Which we'll find out a little bit more later. And then just the second point. So the first point is that he's really trying to explain the gospel, that the essence of gospel is receiving God, what's already there in Christ. And secondly, that the heart of the gospel, the joy, it's about relationship. It's about discovering who God is, right? God's truth, goodness, and beauty. And he talks about that, right? That's the second point. So it's about relationship, joy of relationship through people, yes, but ultimately it's about relationship with God. And the third point is the scope of joy, the scope of the gospel. Normally, Christians think of evangelical Christians would think of a gospel as, yes, our relationship with God, but more what I call vertical and not horizontal. They kind of separate what we do in our normal, ordinary life from our spiritual life, right? Which is problematic if we separate. Our life is one, it's unified. And so the point in telling his own story of how he became to find that, discover that joy, is through ordinary means, nature and people and books and things like that. So he's telling us how wide and broad is this joy and how it comes to us. So I think it's going to be challenging for even Christians and also helpful for non-Christians. So there's much to, I think, be challenged by it. So,
for sure.
Okay. So let me dive into chapter 6 to 10. So beginning with chapter 6, he talks about his experience in the school called Wyvern, which is kind of like a high school / college. The British system is a little different. He was around 15 years old when he went to Wyvern College. It's like high school, sophomore, something like that. And remember, he came from a painful experience of a school system. Like they were supposed to be religious, but he just had a really bad taste because of the bad people and poor system. And now he's going to Wyvern College, and it's more of the bad. I think it's like the worst it can get, right? And so in this chapter, he talks about bloodery, like bloodery. So Rebecca, what is bloodery and what is this thing he calls fagging system? I know the word is not a good word, even back then, and it has different sense. And how did this bloodery and fagging system represent the worst of his society and even our society today?
So it was really that bloodery was really that hierarchy that was formed in Wyvern School, especially to those who are athletic and good looking or stylish. And I thought a lot about like how masculinity plays such a huge part in choosing like the hierarchy of the school. And fagging system was kind of like a byproduct of it, of this hierarchy where these blooderies will really humble down some of their juniors to really work for them and to do their chores and all that. And it almost kind of felt like slavery to a sense. And I thought it was interesting because I don't think I've ever deliberately experienced this kind of like strict hierarchy system, but it's still very present in a lot of different like organizations or schools, not just schools, but also like society where we work in like different companies where the power plays such a huge part, and people with power and authority will treat people lower in a very harsh way. And I think C.S. Lewis had to experience that from a very young age.
Absolutely. To me, I thought of the counterpart for our society is kind of like the idolization of the sports. You know, like the powerful, the strong, and the college athletes or what do you call it? The professionals get a lot of money and fame, and there's the Hollywood, good-looking actresses or so forth, and people wanting to become like them, and the whole social media that loves to make themselves look beautiful to others.
Yeah, it is very focused on the glamours of for both like men and women. Like it's all about the glamours and how they would appear to other people.
Right, and then our generation, so-called the Gen Z generation, right? I don't know. I found that it's 1995. If you were born after 1995 to 2010, then Gen Z. But they're really spending a lot of time on social media, and their hearts are lured by power, this glamour and fame and so forth, right? So in some sense, I think we can pretty much are in a similar situation. Where we could easily, C.S. Lewis describes it as a school life was almost wholly dominated by the social struggle. That's why he hated it so much. It's like our life is all about like, how can I make myself look better to other people, accepted by other people? It's all about like, what's driving me is to be accepted by more powerful people, better looking people, people with money. And so describes our generation, I think, as well.
For sure.
So, Elliot, next question. He says a comment on page 109. It appears to me that there's more alta cura. It's a Latin term for black care. I didn't know this either. I had to look it up. Means black care means worry, anxiety, depression. Okay. So he says, it appears to me that there's more black care in an average schoolboy's week than in a grown man's average year. What do you think he's saying there? What did you get out of that?
So for me, I took it quite literally of the word black care, and knowing that this book was written in 1955, which is when kind of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, all of that was happening. And since these are his childhood experiences, so he's kind of writing a perspective from even before that. And maybe not so much as slavery was being present, but obviously there was that racism and that segregation. And knowing that back then that was such a prominent like part of society where pretty much whites are superior to other races, in this case blacks. But just that thought, and just that from his personal experience, seeing that these people that are supposedly not supposed to be welcome in society are pretty much have better care than just simply adults during that time. So I guess it was just putting that emphasis that adult life is neglected in comparison to blacks at the time.
Wow, I never saw it that way, but you took it literally, and I see that. That's an excellent view. Thank you. Again, back to Gen Z. I looked it up, and one of their characteristics of this generation, Gen Z, is that they're the most under influence. I mean, they're under the influence of social media and glamour and power because they're always on social media. They're influenced in a negative way, right? And so their hearts are like always worrying about like future. They're the loneliest generation. They're the most influenced generation, not in a healthy way, right? So their hearts are like enslaved, as you said, the whole fagging system he was talking about. And so they're emotionally so volatile, and no wonder they have the highest rate of suicide and mental illness and so forth. I think we can see the black care in our generation just as much as his generation.
Mm-hmm.
And so
For sure.
then the question that that I have naturally is that then how can we be free? How can we help this generation to be free from this black care, right?
I think comparison is like a very easy tool that the Satan use to really provoke that anxiety and worries in one's heart. And I have experienced myself, and I'm still experiencing, especially when it comes to career and all that. The fact that you're in this race, and if you fall, other people would run ahead of you is always like trapping you, and is always forcing you to look forward and only run forward. And you're constantly aware that other people are looking at you, and you are also constantly looking at other people. So I guess that's why it's so important to have meditation for our generation. Like, as a Christian, I would go to God and I would have some time with God, and just that time to have a quiet time where I can really focus on my heart and what God wants from me. But even to like non-Christians, like I think our generation really needs that time to reflect and stop and pause.
I really like that, Rebecca. We need rest. Right? We need quiet time with God, because we're so busy looking at each other. That's excellent. So moving on, we'll pick up that thought more later. The next chapter, Light and Shade, Lewis talks about how he became a prig, P-R-I-G. I didn't know what that meant either. I had to look it up. So a prig is like a morally self-righteous person who thinks they are superior to other people, usually in reaction to to the other's superiority. Does that make sense? Like, you're kind of jealous of them for being superior on something. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to fight back with my superiority. Like that kind of a person, right? Which I think we can all kind of somehow relate to. So how does Lewis see himself as a prig, or how did he become a prig and relate himself to this figure in the northern mythology figure of Loki, right? We know that from the Marvel comics. Yes.
Yeah, it was interesting because when I think of Thor, like, I've been watching too many Marvel movies, I guess. I always think of this very like just powerful good dude. Yes. Good god. And when we think of Loki, like, although there are some fans of Loki's, like it's more like thought of as like more like a villain almost, right? But how he compared himself to Loki, and how he portrayed Loki as the one with wisdom and who's not understood but has more intelligence was very interesting, and how he made Thor this like someone who's just using, like, abusing the power, the physical power. And I think that was like one of his insecurities, like the fact that he's not the most athletic, sporty, powerful, like physically powerful person. So I think that is why he focused so much on like books and like his intelligence and his wisdom.
Right. I think we could ask ourselves this question: am I more like Thor, or am I more like Loki? Right? What do you think, Elliot?
I would have to say that I think I am more like Loki.
Okay.
But I think, or like in the book, the way he describes it, I thought it was very similar to the first Thor movie.
Okay.
Before Thor kind of went through his character development, learning not to be so rash and impulsive. I know in the first scene where he pretty much, prior to losing his powers, it shows a scene of him being kind of acting too much on emotion, and we see Loki trying to hold him back. So just that scene from that first movie kind of reminded me of that passage where he talks about the relationship and conversation that Thor, Odin, and Loki has. But I think for me personally, I think I'm more like Loki, but I also feel like kind of that impulsiveness and just like wanting to be proactive and like wanting a little bit more is also there for me. So
Good. Well, the way I read it, Loki is reacting to a problem that he sees in Thor rather than, so he's reacting from something like a jealousy, I think. Like, I am wise, and I don't rely on strength like you do, but I'm wise. It's better to be wise than rely on strength, that kind of thing, right? And this is kind of the way we think sometimes. We think our characteristic, our good trait as something that is reactionary, right? And I think that's the point that Lewis is making is that can be really dangerous, right? An example that I think of is a lot of parents that come to our school. They say, we're at this school because we just want to run away from CRT and LGBTQ and same-sex marriage, and so that's all fine, right? But what is your goal of education for your child? What is your vision of education for your child? And a lot of people just don't have anything to say. They haven't actually thought about it. They're more thinking about running away from what they don't want, and not really think about what's the purpose of life. Anyway, that's just an example that I can think of. Next question. So for Elliot, how did Lewis says public school system, since we're talking about education, public school system for him produced the very thing which it was advertised to prevent or cure. So what does he mean by that? I directly quoted what he said in the book, and it's on page 130. And it says, where oppression does not completely and permanently break the spirit, has it not a natural tendency to produce retaliatory pride and contempt? So I guess back then, the more traditional education system, or even in household, is for the kid to be respectful, or it is similar to now, but I guess more emphasis was put on it. So I guess through this system, they were trying to kind of get rid of these rebellious, like impulsive behaviors within the children. But obviously through kind of like the fagging system and like the flogging, kids kind of take that negatively, where like they don't want to be put down, but they feel like it's being forced on them. So naturally they want to act out and say like, this isn't what I want. I want to be a certain way. And like this whole system is just forcing things on me, which is kind of a way, I think, of how Lewis felt through this whole experience as well. So, which also kind of relates back to him being a prig. Kind of through the whole system, he's like, yeah, this isn't for me. And kind of like disagreeing with the whole thing. So he kind of talks about himself in a way where, yeah, I want to rebel. Yes, and from this, I was able to extrapolate the principle that if we try to force, the word you use, I agree, it's forcing humility. You try to force a child or an adult to become humble. And the result is that they actually become the opposite, right? You can apply this to our Christian practice. Like, you have to do this. You have to come to Sevakidar. Like, not that I'm against it. Like, if you have to do this in order to humble yourself before God, next thing you know, like, I go to Sevakidar every day. I do Bible reading and prayer every day. I'm better than you. Well, you just turned something opposite of what it was designed to do. Or school, or in our social context. If we're forced to become humble, we produce the opposite effect. Terrible experience that I think we all can probably say something about. But the next question, during these dark years for C.S. Lewis, how did his teacher, Smewgy, I think that's how you pronounce it, interesting spelling here, Smewgy become a light to C.S. Lewis?
So I think not just Smewgy, but he talks about several different people. C.S. Lewis talks about several different people in his life, and although it was not mentioned in like a Christianese kind of way, but I could like see how there were like characteristics of God in like each individuals. And for Smewgy, I thought it was the gentleness. And
Definitely.
he definitely talks a lot about how he was of like a good manner and he would be gentle. And that's why even the Bloods were not able to like rebel against him. And how I think it is very interesting because we often think that being aggressive or like directly showing the power really scares people, but like having this gentleness controlling people was very interesting to see how he had that subtle power of gentleness.
Right. It said that in his class, Smewgy's class, there's no distinction. He made it sure that there's no distinction between the Bloods and the fags, the juniors, right? So I think you have a sense that Lewis sitting in that Smewgy's classroom, there's a sense of, it's a different culture. Like I can be myself. I can speak freely. And he can learn this graceful manner from the teacher himself. He calls everybody gentlemen. And he felt respected. So there's a different dynamic going on, right? It's not just like, I feel respected. I think he began to see something deeper, the meaning of life. And particularly the way in which Smewgy does this is he actually he's a Latinist and Greek scholar, right? So he goes through all the grammar and syntax and so forth. But at the same time, and poetry, of course. He said Lewis learned poetry, to love poetry. He read poetry all along, but never really loved it. But now it finally, it became something meaningful to him. And the way I saw it is like a window through which God was shining his light of grace.
For sure.
In the midst of all this social struggle that he was going through.
Yeah, on like page 137, he talks about how Smewgy was like the reminder of things more gracious, more humane, larger and cooler, which really ties along with what you just said about like God showing through the window of Smewgy.
Right, it's probably one of the first times that Lewis began to see the connection between good scholarship, like we're doing good book study, right? Good scholarship and grace. He actually says because he hated study so far, right? School turned him, he didn't want the schooling. But through Smewgy, just unexpectedly, he's beginning to see that maybe I can find God through good way of studying. Okay, next chapter is about how his relationship with his dad, right, Elliot? So describe why Lewis was having such a bad relationship with his dad during this period.
Guess just simply put, his relationship with his dad was very like, his dad was always right and Lewis was always wrong. And kind of what it made me think about was the difference between hearing and listening to someone. And I feel like those two are very different things.
Yes.
And I think hearing is just kind of like the acknowledgement of someone saying something to you. But listening is also the interpretation of what is being told or said. And I think he says, or we know that his father would always misinterpret and kind of relay a story or information back to Lewis with, let's say, like different characters or like different facts, I guess, and would say that, or he would tell Lewis that, no, you told me it that way. So I'm right and you messed up. So you shouldn't have given me misinformation from the first. But as readers, we know, or from Lewis's perspective, this relationship between his father was constantly full of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. So I think that's why it was very hard for him to talk to his father.
Right, and it's his own dad, you know, and his own surviving parent, right? Mother's already passed away, and so much rides on that good relationship. But he was always there, but he was not always there. It felt as if he was talking to a wall or something like that, right? So you can tell that even though his father was generally, you know, caring father and provided, you know, good education, at least tried to, and ended up sending him to ultimately a good series of bad schools and then ultimately, you know, good tutor. But a lot of the scars, right, doubts that he had, I think stems from his relationship with his dad. I think a lot of children, you know, probably have a similar story. Maybe a parent or a teacher, you know. Yeah, I know a ton of these stories from my own school. A lot of our teachers are great, but sometimes teachers, but sometimes a parent, a child carries this burden of painful, just lack of connection with their parent many times. But next question is, so during this period of what I call the external turmoil, there's turmoil going on at the school, turmoil going on with his relationship with his dad. There's a beginning of a change, and he calls this release, the title of the chapter. There were books that he discovered, and there was a friend, right, named Arthur. How did these books and Arthur help to change the course of his life?
So, first talking about Arthur, I think Arthur is the first friend that he genuinely appreciates this much. And the fact that he found someone that is so much like him. And C.S. Lewis talks about how they both knew the sap of joy and they both loved the Nordic myth. And it was like finding that other half, right? You're just like me kind of thing.
He couldn't believe it.
Yeah, and I think that connection, since although Lewis had his brother, like Lewis was always like craving for that relationship and like human interaction. And I think this one was one of the first genuine equal friendship that he was able to build with someone, which was why it was so relieving in that sense.
You know, this is, I think, where you find, you know, shadowy form, his understanding of the definition of a true friend, which he later elaborates on his another very popular book called Four Loves. He talks about 4 kinds of loves. There's the, you know, agape love from God, and then there's the paternal love, and then there's a brotherly love, and then there's anyway 4 loves, right? Besides the agape love, which is the strongest and more lasting or something like that, it is brotherly love. And the way he defines brotherly love, I'm pretty sure he had Arthur's relationship in mind. I don't know if he can kind of come up with a definition of a true friendship based on his friendship with Arthur. Can you give a guess? What is a true definition of a brotherly love? Either one of you. What's happening here with his relationship with Arthur that constitutes the beginning of a true friendship?
Maybe understanding and kind of common interests.
Bingo. So common love is how he defines it. So it's not so much based on, you know, how do people usually define a true friendship? It's like, if you're loyal to each other, like BFF, best friends forever, like I can die for you. I spend a ton of time eating out with you. That's not it, he says. It's about what we love in common. And for them, it's ultimately God. And it's through like their love of Nordic mythology and other things. But it's ultimately God. It's common love. and it's commitment to the common love that really brings them closer and closer and closer together. And we'll see more of that later. But true friendship here we see. And then the next chapter takes us to the Great Knock, as he's known. He's the tutor. After miserable years of bad schooling, the father finally wakes up and sends him off to the tutor that actually tutored him, the father, as well as the brother, Lewis's brother, Wardy. Is it Wardy? Anyway, father and the brother. So now he learns under Kirkpatrick or Kirk or Great Knock. So how was Lewis's education under Mr. Kirk a cure for Lewis?
Or I think throughout the chapters up until now, I think if every time Lewis has had a conversation with an adult, we can see kind of everyone saying that you're still a kid, we know better because we're older, and kind of like how he felt out of place in like the parties when in his earlier childhood, and kind of how they looked like they told him that he was being a show-off whenever he would use bigger words. And then we see now with his father saying that I'm right and you're wrong. I think this is the first time we see kind of like that teacher figure or older person saying that, oh, I want to know what you have to say. And he said in the book, he says the most encouraging of all was I hear you, when Kirk would tell him that I hear you. And I think he also did say Kirk was a person that thought about what you said and not about you. So I think that really shows the difference between the other adults, because the other adults would see him as a kid and automatically think, oh, he doesn't know any better. But Kirk always sat down to listen to what he had to say, despite his age or what his possible views on the world would be. And I also kind of related this back to kind of like religion, where despite everyone in society and in this world telling you that you're wrong, and I think as like kids growing up, we feel like kind of being Christian is uncool and kind of like the weird one, odd one out at certain times. But I think it shows here that well, in Lewis's situation, it was Kirk, but in our situation, it's God, where despite all and everyone around us saying that, oh, you're wrong, we'll always have that. We'll always have God accepting us for who we are. And always kind of just like that best friend to just sit down and really have that talk with.
Right. Kirk was a Protestant, and actually he became an atheist. It's an interesting case, right? But still, Lewis found that Kirk to be one of the most formative teachers in his life for that reason, right? Because he actually listened and cared for Lewis. And also, I think even though as a non-Christian, he ultimately sought after the truth, right? He cared about the truth. And he was, remember, really strict in his logic and made sure that whatever Lewis said is logical. And he also loved nature. Remember, he loved taking walks in nature. And Lewis always loved nature, but he began to love nature more and seek God in nature, I think, through him. For sure.
Also, I feel like throughout this book, there's a lot of parallels where in his early childhood, the experiences that he has in his early childhood are very similar to the experiences that he has in his teenage years, but obviously they're in different situations. I remember in chapter 5, when he feels that, the first time he feels that stab of joy again, with the music and the different books that he's read, I remember him saying that there was a slight realization where he said this sense of longing turned out to be his longing for God. And I think we see that again here as like he dives into that literature and that nature again. He kind of feels as if, or that realization is present again, where through Kirk he's like, oh, maybe this is
right. So
that figure that he's been longing for.
Very good. There's a principle we draw from this learning from a non-Christian, an atheist. Used to be a Christian, but now an atheist. can you learn from a non-Christian? The answer is yes. Even better than most of the Christians that Lewis met. Why? Because he thirsted after truth. He seemed to enjoy more of God as an atheist in like a preliminary way than a lot of Christians in their hypocritical way of living, right? Living out their life. And also has implication for the kinds of books that we could and should read, which is the classics. Remember, this is the first time that really Lewis really dug into these classics, both in Latin and Greek, right? And he really saw the light of God through these books because of his teacher, his example to him. And what an implication it has for us. We shouldn't be afraid to read the great pagan classics because sometimes they speak louder to us about God than some of the Christian people.
And like the fact that Kirk was someone who was constantly encouraging you to ask why. I think there's a huge difference between religion and faith, and I think that difference comes from whether you question why or not. Like religious, you can like follow without questioning why, but faith, you will always have to want to learn and want to know why. And I think that is so crucial in how he was building his faith.
I like that, Rebecca, a lot. Yes, that's what we emphasize in our school is the question. It's sometimes more important to know how to ask question than the answer. Obviously, we need both, but Kirk definitely helped him to raise questions about God. So then the next question is, what does Lewis mean when he says that the true training of anything, whatever that is good, always prefigures the true training for Christian life? Rebecca?
I think that is pretty much similar to what we've been saying on how we can literally find God in every goodness of this world, and how like we can see him in nature, we can see him in the literature and people, and how the messages we learn from those goodness of the world is ultimately how we are supposed to look at God's goodness.
Absolutely. God created and he owns the whole world. Why not search for him everywhere? Amen. The next question is the next chapter. It's the last chapter. So the story of his growing relationship with Arthur. How did Arthur influence Lewis regarding the choice of books and regarding what he calls ordinariness or homeliness? Elliot?
I think through reading the classics, Arthur taught Lewis that these books have a lot of relatability and kind of depicts similar experiences that any person could have in through literature. And I think the biggest thing is that relatability is, I believe that relatability is the most important part of understanding. And I think it's what piques people's interest. So just that like seek or wanting to know more and the seek of more knowledge comes from relatability to whatever it is. I feel like if there's just that tiny part of the story or a tiny part to this book or to this religion, I think people find that topic or issues, situations to be applicable to themselves, which kind of makes them want to know more.
Right, relatability, that's a key word. That's kind of like ordinariness or homeliness, which is like earthly things instead of heavenly things. Remember, he was, up to this point, he was more focused on like what he calls fantastic books, which are more like heavenly or otherworldly, right? Like the northernness and so forth. But now, for the first time, really, he's like, you mean I can find beauty and goodness of God in ordinary life? And he starts to read Sir Walter Scott, the Waverley series, Bronte sisters, Jane Austen's. I don't know if you read any of them, but they're all very down to earth. You can't get more down to earth than some of these books, like the romantic novels and so forth, which some people hate because like, ooh, I don't like romantic stories. But they're not. It's not about what we think of as cheesy romances. They're actually about God's truth, goodness, and beauty in a very ordinary day-to-day life problems.
Yeah.
And that's what he got through Arthur. I said, dude, you're missing out.
Yeah, I kind of agree because I feel like we often talk about how we will be able to rest when we go on like overseas trip where we go to this like wonderful like tourist spots where we can see all this like splendid I don't know like landscape and all that. But I think we should like practice on like finding the beauty in our like daily life. And even with our faith, I know a lot of people, including myself, go like, oh, I'm gonna change after this retreat or this mission trip. But like, I think I also get so much blessing from the daily devotion that I do, or even like a very small like prayer session that I have by myself, or like a praise song that I listen.
Or for him, he uses like even a piece of vegetable, like literally, like just in nature or just the mundane things. Just look up in the sky and look at the trees or something. Look at the piece of vegetable. You find God.
And I think this book is such a good example for just non-believers. Because I also, with a friend that I've talked to recently about religion or just kind of what he thinks about it, he told me that he doesn't think it's for him. And previously when he did go to church, he said sermons were boring. So he would just be on his phone in the back. And I think it's because of that lack of relatability that people find. And I think a lot of non-believers feel like it's too late, or, oh, I've never been in that situation. I've never been in a church setting. So if I go, like, I'm just going to feel out of place. But I think just like how we have QTs and have that time of prayer or worship, I feel like outside of that, and I know he said that Arthur's taught Lewis that these similarities can be applied to out the door experiences.
Absolutely.
So I think it directly kind of shows in our life where like it doesn't necessarily have to be that kind of like in the room by yourself praying to God. It can just be, it can also be like within the community and with people. So I think this book just shows that God is apparent in everything in our life and everything that we do. So
we know that literally later on, that literally the turning point and where he actually accepts Christ into his heart is while he's looking at trees on a bus. And we'll read that later. But absolutely, ordinariness, how God shines through ordinary activities or nature. So, Rebecca, why does Lewis think that a boy in his teens reading too much newspaper is a dangerous thing?
I think we have to mention the fact that this was during World War I, and how there were so many news and articles about wars and almost kind of sensationalizing it and glamorizing it without really letting them understand what it truly means. And I think it applies to modern day as well, on how we are absorbing all of these informations without really understanding the context behind it and truly knowing what it really is. And I think Lewis kind of wanted to emphasize on the fact that the boys aren't ready, simply. And there needs to be that step where that's required to like fully understand what's going on.
Yes. Yeah, I saw a title of a book called Neil Postman, and some other popular book by him, but Informing Ourselves to Death. Amusing Ourselves to Death was his first popular book. Now he has a sequel, Informing Ourselves to Death. you know, all the social media, you know, the big techs, they what do you call it, manipulate or control, you know, the information that we get, like the Big Brothers watching things. So we're in the thick of it. This whole propagandizing or sensationalizing information. And kids are not ready for it. And they can be brainwashed so easily. And it is dangerous. So on the one hand, he's talking about we can discover God through ordinary things, but he's talking about like nature or just pure good books, you know, not sensationalized version of information. So I think he's talking about importance of distinction there. So finally, Eliot, in this final chapter, he talks about how one of the worst acts of his life, you know, what was that, and why does he think it's so bad?
He said that going through confirmation and the communion without really knowing what it is and what it meant was the worst act in his life. And I guess he felt it was so bad because he was kind of living this lie or he said he was showing this lie with greatest possible solemnity. And I think I've also experienced this too, where like, I guess we have it during Christmas and Easter and maybe like the church anniversary. But I remember as a kid, it's just, oh, we take turns and like my mom walks up. So I just go up and like, oh, the bread tastes good and the juice tastes good. So it's just kind of like these very like, just like, oh, I'm up there because I feel like I have to. But now I realized recently or not recently, but it's just, I go up there and not really knowing what I'm doing and not knowing really the meaning behind it kind of got to me a little. And reading this, reading him talk about his experience in that as well, kind of made me feel guilty as well, where like, oh, I used to think like that. And I used to not know what it means. And I used to say that I'll change, like this, let this be a new beginning. And I would just fall back into the world right away.
Why is it so bad?
I think it's just, I guess for me, it's just, it feels like I'm directly lying to God.
Exactly.
So it's just, yeah, just that knowing, but still doing it is just that feeling of guiltiness.
It's so bad because not only you lied to God, you lied to yourself. It's killing your soul to lie. You're like, you don't really believe in this stuff, but you're pretending like you do. That's what he's talking about. It's what more dangerous thing is there than pretending like you believe in God? Because God is a source of life, and to pretend it, what are the consequences? So he recognizes that as the worst act of his life. And of course, we're going to see how he repents of this, right? That was a great discussion. We have one more next time to finish the last portion of this book. And I really look forward to a lively discussion again.
I'm also excited.
Very excited to finish the book and see how kind of that conversion and see how kind of like, I guess for this week was the big thing was relatability and see how that conversion story can be relatable to us and those who are watching.
Amen, amen. Can't wait. Okay, we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.